Bob Herbst, the civil rights lawyer and co-chair of the board of ICAHD-USA, the North American affiliate of the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions. And for decades now, ICAHD has been a strong voice against Israeli policies, practices of home demolitions, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and settler colonialism. We provide a ready source of reliable information on the ground in Israel-Palestine, and we work towards the day when the systemic domination of Palestinians will end and all inhabitants of the land will share it equally in one democratic state from the river to the sea. We are so pleased to welcome Mark Braverman today, the Executive Director of Kairos USA, who also serves on the International Coordinating Committee of Global Kairos for Justice. Mark is a psychologist, a former Zionist turned anti-Zionist, and he has long been one of the most incisive and articulate voices in the Palestinian solidarity movement. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the gracious courtesy of our mutual friends, Phil Weiss and Monda Weiss, in helping us publicize this webinar. And let me just remind you all, please stay muted during our conversation and put your questions in the chat so that we can keep an eye out for them and incorporate them into the discussion, especially in the last 45 minutes or so today. Excuse me. And if you can keep your comments other than questions in the chat to a minimum, that'll help us pick up the questions more quickly. And please also be advised this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the ICAHD website and YouTube channel for future reference. Mark, welcome. I'm going to start by telling folks here how this discussion between us started and why I suggested that we consider shifting the focus of the discourse around Palestinian liberation and solidarity to more emphatically emphasize an attack on Israeli apartheid rather than Zionism, and then turn it over to you to respond, and that should get us off and running. In early January, this past year, we both received a Jerusalem Post column written by Gershon Baskin, an American liberal Zionist who made Aliyah to Israel in 1978, and who had worked for Jewish-Arab coexistence and the end of the occupation. In that column, Baskin announced that in light of Israel's intransigence and unwillingness to end the occupation and the resulting death of the two-state solution, he had become a proponent of one person, one vote in one state in which every human being between the river and the sea would enjoy equality. Mark and I both welcomed his change of heart. After all, it's still not every day that we see these transformations in print. But Mark noticed that Baskin was advocating one democratic state without addressing the issue of Zionism itself. It's not about democracy, it's about Zionism, Mark said, which prompted me, after thinking about it, to ask Mark, is it really necessary anymore to make a frontal assault on Zionism, as opposed to apartheid, an internationally recognized crime against humanity? Obviously, a lot of people still cling to Zionism, thinking it's a good thing. But who can be for crimes against humanity? Who can be for apartheid? Perhaps it's about democracy rather than Zionism. Perhaps the better issue for our advocacy is democracy versus apartheid. One man, one vote in one truly democratic state. I asked Mark, might there be some wisdom in skipping the fight over the label Zionist, since it has different meanings to different people? The political Zionism of Herzl, Jabotinsky, and the Jewish supremacists, for whom a Jewish homeland was not enough. They needed a Jewish political state run by and for Jews. And the historic cultural Zionism of Martin Buber and Ahad Aham, Jews who were willing to share the land with Palestinian Arabs equally. Maybe the better way to formulate the issue is just to say we prefer democracy to apartheid, rather than we are anti-Zionists, we need you to be too. Perhaps we can even appeal to Zionists like Baskin who are comfortable or can bring themselves to get comfortable, combining their Zionism with one man, one vote in a democratic state with equal rights rather than Jewish supremacy. If they can do that, who are we to say no? and rub their faces in their Zionism and further alienate them from their Jewish moral and religious roots, which are so anathema to apartheid. Mark and I agreed that this was a really important strategic question that we needed to keep talking about, and we ultimately decided to bring that conversation here. So Mark, let me quickly lay out some of the reasons why I think it might make strong tactical and strategic sense to recast the issue from Palestinians against Zionists, or democracy versus Zionism, democracy or equal rights versus apartheid. And then I will turn the floor over to you to respond. First and foremost, because apartheid is an internationally recognized crime that can be prosecuted. So the charge packs a powerful punch. Once that case is made that Israel is an apartheid state or an apartheid regime, as all of the human rights reports in the last 2 years have done in detail, once the apartheid narrative frame is established, our side can make a very strong argument that discussion must end and action should begin. Either action to dismantle the regime or action in the international criminal courts to prosecute its perpetrators. For my entire lifetime, the 75 years, people on our side have attacked Zionism and its racist, settler, colonialist attributes, and it's been a difficult struggle for many reasons we all know. There have been some successes, but enormous pushback emanating from the trauma of the Holocaust, Christian anti-Semitism, the need for security, all giving Israel and Zionism a pass. It's been a tough sell to get the churches and the rest of the international community to become anti-Zionist. A tough sell here in the US to get 5 million American Zionist Jews to become anti-Zionist and 50 million American Christian Zionists to become anti-Zionist. But in the last 2 years, with the publication of these reports, I think the apartheid frame has taken hold with, I think, amazing speed, suddenness, and it seems to me, staying power. And the pro-Israeli forces have really been unable to defend against the apartheid charge on the merits, because the similarities with South African apartheid are so striking, as some of us discussed with South African Methodist Minister Brian Brown last week. And also because there's a legal definition in the international conventions, particularly the one on the suppression and punishment of the crime against apartheid, and a legal definition in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, both of which fit Israeli apartheid like a glove. So lacking a defense on the merits, and frankly, I have been shocked at what little effort Israeli and American Jews have made to defend against the charge of apartheid on the merits, they're left to play the anti-Semitism card, which is having less and less of an effect as the right-wing control of Israeli government and society takes even stronger hold, and the mask comes off the apartheid structure of Palestinian oppression by the Jewish state. Even the New York Times is using the word. There was an article only yesterday in which the claim of Israeli apartheid was in the headline. That was a first. I haven't seen that before. I mean, it being in the headline, not in the paper. It's been in the paper since the publication of those reports 2 years ago. And along with the word has come increasing access to mainstream media by Palestinians, Palestinian Americans, and their solidarity activists. This is a gift I did not anticipate, and arguably we should be totally focused on exploiting it. Second, the only way the current state of oppression in Israel is going to end is if the international community comes together to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel as it did South Africa. Israel will not reform itself. Jewish Israelis will not reform themselves without that outside pressure. So it seems to me that focusing on apartheid as a crime is essential to more effectively generating such outside pressure, both here and abroad, and has greater prospects for success than continuing to focus on Zionism or settler colonialism or even racism. Third, while Zionism can mean different things to different people, people like Baskin see the possibility of Jews and non-Jews sharing the land as cultural Zionists. And we could admit the possibility that Zionism can be cleansed of its anti-Palestinian Jewish supremacy, consistent with one democratic state for all. And I think we could construct an argument for equality and sharing that might appeal to liberal Zionists, so that by keeping Zionists like potential Baskins at arm's length, or worse, alienating them, we may be shooting ourselves and our Palestinian brothers and sisters in the foot. Fourth, and finally, focusing on apartheid rather than Zionism provides a much easier defense against allegations of anti-Semitism. To that charge, we can simply say it is not anti-Semitic to oppose a crime against humanity, to oppose the crime of apartheid, even apartheid by Jews. Isn't it better than arguing that it's not anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist? We're getting lost in debates about what Zionism is or is not, or whether it's good or bad. I think it's a lot tougher to credibly equate anti-apartheidism with anti-Semitism than it is to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Now, that doesn't mean ending the discussion about Zionism or settler colonialism or racism. Those concepts are actually corollaries of the apartheid framing. But I'm tentatively suggesting for serious consideration a change in emphasis and a laser focus on the crime of apartheid until we permanently imprint on Israel the apartheid frame and label. It might be looking a gift horse in the mouth not to put that powerful frame and label front and center. Instead of calling out, quote, the despicable intent and behavior perpetrated by Zionism, in Mark's words to me in January, we could call out instead the criminal behavior of Israeli apartheiders. We can call for their prosecution and for the international boycott, divestment, and sanction of the criminal structure of the Israeli apartheid regime. All right, Mark, that's my case. The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, that's a lot, Bob, and we're going to need to go back and forth with some of these, but let me respond with what I think sort of my opener. First of all, thanks for setting this up. Thanks for coming up with the idea after our initial exchange to sort of go public with this. A lot of people have turned up. Obviously, people really want to talk about this. So your pitch and your framing of this really worked. So I want to make sure we get to the part where people can ask questions and we can start to really open this up. So hopefully you and I will not hog this stage for too long. Also reading, I went back to our correspondence, and it sort of brings back to my mind how wonderful sort of the epistolary style in literature is. I find that when I'm writing emails and letters back and forth to people, it's like it's my best work, you know. It's wonderful. So I treasure what we managed to have put on the screen, and now I have it in a file. And I went back to it, and you presented pretty well sort of what we were talking about. So as you were talking about apartheid, so let me just start with this. I mean, there's so many places for us to go. Let me just start with this. About a couple of months ago, somewhere last winter, in Jewish Currents, which is, I recommend to everybody. It's a little, yeah, it's about $35 to sign up for it, but it's a wonderful paper written by not liberal, but radical Jews in the best tradition. Nura Erekat, I'm sure you all know her name, and I think his name was Williams. She co-authored with somebody I didn't recognize. Wrote a really wonderful piece, and maybe, you know, we can, I should have gotten the link to it, but you can get it to people. I can't remember the name of the title of it, but it was, she said, about apartheid, apartheid is not our target. We need a radical analysis, a radical critical analysis of apartheid. because apartheid is a technique, it's a method, it's an expression of the root problem, which is settler colonialism. And once you do that, you have changed the discourse and you've changed the strategy, which is, I think, what we really need to be talking about today. I'm hoping that we can start as soon as possible to focus on what does this mean? It's not just an academic discussion, apartheid or Zionism. It really means something for our movement. You know, the Jews, starting with at the beginning of the 20th century, who signed up to be part of the Zionist program and to emigrate to Palestine, did not know that they were signing up for a criminal colonial project. They were sold the bill of goods. They had no idea what Ben Gurion and his henchmen were actually up to. They thought they were going to found a wonderful society. So now they're living in a single state apartheid reality. The ones who can get out are getting out, right? But here's the thing: you can't reform apartheid, but you can try to reform apartheid. That's what the South Africans tried to do when the pressure started. And I guess starting in the 80s, they had all kinds of ideas. It's okay, we'll reform this. You know, we'll clean it up. We'll let the blacks into our legislatures. They won't have full votes, but we'll let them in our legislatures. And then they came up with a two-state solution, which was the Bantustans. And that's exactly what it was. It was a two-state solution, which was basically another expression of apartheid. So you can try to reform apartheid. It doesn't work. And the world didn't accept it. But you can try to reform it. You can't reform a settler colonial project. You can't say, okay, this is not colonialism. And that's what Israel is up to. Apartheid is only something that de facto has happened because they were unsuccessful in dealing with their basic problem, which was Palestinians, the indigenous population is still there. And by the way, they won't give up. So I think strategically, we can't afford to get hung up on apartheid because there'll be more tricks. You know, it's easy, as you say, it's easy to point out that apartheid is bad, right? It's racism. You know. It's not so easy to say, well, we'll stop our colonial project, because the colonial project is basically already a done deal, except that now there is resistance. And so, as in the case of, Algeria, for example, the colonials, the colonized did not give up, and they ended up booting the French out. So, by the way, another wonderful article, and I've got something coming out of Mondoweiss probably today or tomorrow, which has a link to the work of Eitan Bronstein, who just recently gave a wonderful speech where he talked about the Pied Noir in Algeria. And a lot of the French decided not to leave. They decided to give up their colonial identity. And he says that's what really Jewish Israelis have to do. You don't have to leave. You can live in this new reality, but you just have to figure out how to get out of your colonial mindset. It's brilliant stuff. Anyway, so get to my Mondoweiss article. You don't have to get hung up on my words. Go to the various links that are in there. That's really where the gold is. So that's what I'll have. That's sort of my opening shot about apartheid. Apartheid is not the problem. Zionism is the problem. And Zionism is a problem not because it ends up with a racist apartheid separatist reality. It's a problem because it's colonialism. And so it's much bigger than Israel. It's an expression of the whole neoliberal order. We're not going to get there by talking about apartheid. It's an phenomenon. Right, so that's the first thing. I'll skip over talking about BDS. I'm going to agree. I hope that where I get to at the end here is that BDS is the only thing that we can do besides dealing with the theological stuff, which I'll mention, because that's the way for us to be in solidarity with Palestinian resistance. At one point, you're probably saving this for later. At one point, you were, well, you make the point about we don't want to alienate the liberal Zionists because we can bring them around and we can be allies with them. The liberal Zionists are not allies. They're not potential allies unless they stop being liberal Zionists. They are the enemy. You know, when the South Africans wrote their Kairos document back in the 80s, and it was a challenge to the church. Their big challenge was, and their focus was, not the Pretoria government, but the way the church was massaging and distorting its own theology and its own practice to support apartheid by playing with words and saying, well, we have to preserve order, or we're going to work for justice, but their justice was the justice of the oppressor. So liberal Zionists, and here's my sort of basic point, and this is why I'm always going off about Peter Beinart, is that there's no question that liberal Zionists are appalled by the treatment of the Palestinians. There's no question that they recognize that crimes have been committed and crimes are going on. But they're not willing to take the next step, which is to say, it's because of our basic ideology and the basis and the fundamentals of the Zionist program that this was inevitable. It has to lead there. And the only way we're going to get out of this is by acknowledging that Zionism, in my words, was because I understand it as a Jew down to my cells, Zionism and the whole Zionist impulse was an understandable, catastrophic mistake. It's not the answer to anti-Semitism. So until we say, oops, a big oops, there's no hope, certainly for the Jewish community, to ever get ourselves out of the hole that we dug ourselves. And our allies have to be not well-meaning liberal people who are horrified and saddened by what has happened to their dream of Israel. Our allies, and actually I think allies is the wrong word. We have to be in solidarity with the Palestinian people and their resistance. It's their fight. It's not our fight. Our fight. It's not our fight. We have to be in solidarity with them. And the best way we can do that, there are two things. One is BDS. BDS, BDS, BDS. To paraphrase Hakeem Jeffries, BDS yesterday, BDS today, BDS forever. The other, and here's where the churches fit into the strategy, is that we have to take on the Bible and we have to take on Christian Zionism. I won't go off on that now, but I'll just say, people may want to talk about it more. There are many among us here who, Don, for example, Don Wagner, who deeply into working on that with me and others. Christian Zionism is with us today. It's been with us forever because the Bible has been used. I mean, the original colonial Anglo settlers of this country did that, taking the Bible and saying, we're using the Bible as a justification for ethnically cleansing the indigenous population. And that's today, there are two forms of it. There's the literalist biblical form, but there's also the liberal form, which says, who are we, Christians, to question the Jewish liberation movement? You know, we have too much guilt, we have too much responsibility, we're going to let them do it. But the essence of Christian Zionism is exceptionalism. Christian Zionists say the Jews are special. And then they hit you right on it and say, if the Jews are special, we're special. We are also the house of Israel. So it has definite political implications. It's used in political ways. It injects itself into human affairs immediately. So we have to take that on biblically and theologically. That's the job of the theologians. That's the job of the churches. That's the job of people in the pews. That's the job of clergy. And one thing that we can do here in the United States, and it's happening on a global basis, is to continue to help and mobilize the churches to take this on. And that is underway. Politically and in terms of resistance and organization, the churches are way ahead. They've already endorsed apartheid. They've already rejected the two-state, acknowledged the lie and the deception of the two-state solution as a way to continue the colonial project. But even more important, they've said Christian Zionism is against our faith. And that is a very, very strong political statement. So also, you talked about the anti-Semitism charge. I think it's great that that battle has been engaged. I think it's great that now that we're talking about the weaponization of anti-Semitism, we have named it, and that says volumes. That says that the anti-Semitism charge is a tactic on the part of apologists for Israel and Zionism. That's terrific. And you can stand up and say anti-Semitism. Well, I'm not anti-Semitic. It's not anti-Semitic to challenge the state of Israel or to criticize the state of Israel for its human rights crimes. The most important thing about that, though, is that embedded in that statement and in that response is to say that Zionism is not Judaism and the Jewish people is not the state of Israel. Again, apartheid and the concept of apartheid and international law and all of that plays no part in that. When we take on Zionism and name it, what we are saying as Jews and as Christians for that matter, is that it is not who we are. We don't have to take it for granted. We don't have to find a way to make it work. It's not who we are. And it has to go. And we keep coming back to that when we argue back and forth. I try to take on your arguments. I argued against myself, and then I go back and argued against myself again and said, no, sorry, no, I can't do it. I can't do it. It comes back to Zionism always.
All right, well, let me just respond to some things you said, because you quoted Nora Erekat, who says apartheid is not the target, or shouldn't be the target. It's not, and you yourself said apartheid is not the problem. I agree that settler colonialism is a problem, that racism is a problem, part of it, part of the problem we're discussing, and Zionism is a part of the problem. But I think it's important to make apartheid the problem and to make apartheid the target, because we are fighting a political battle and a battle for hearts and minds. And as a trial lawyer who's tried cases to juries for decades, I can tell you that the narrative frame that is implanted in the jury's mind, and usually initially by the party that has the burden of proof, stays in there a long time, and it's hard to get it out. And to me, as a tool of advocacy, there's nothing like apartheid. I'm not against discussing these other elements that as many of the questioners have pointed out, settler colonialism is a part of apartheid. It was true in South Africa as in Israel. The Boers, the Afrikaners, considered themselves the chosen people on land granted to them by God. It was a settler colonial project, and they were open about it. They were not ashamed about it. And the only way it got dismantled was when the international community, after 45 years since the first apartheid government in 1948 in South Africa, and of course longer since the establishment of the Union of South Africa in 1910. But the international community finally was mobilized because apartheid was a crime. It wasn't so much because it was a settler colonial project, but the mobilization was around apartheid. And what I'm suggesting is that in order to fight this battle more effectively, we need to organize ourselves around that same narrative frame, because the similarities are utterly striking. And because it's a crime that once acknowledged, it cannot be reformed. You cannot reform an apartheid structure. You have to dismantle it. And in fact, they did dismantle the structure, the political structure in South Africa. And the Afrikaners decided to do it themselves. The Afrikaners, who were the enemy, like the Zionists, who Mark considers the enemy, finally decided to do it themselves. Now, they were able to preserve a lot of economic advantages. So the battle is not done, but the structure, the political structure, was dismantled. So, you know, Mark, you say the Zionists are the enemies. Yes and no, because they also represent the people who need to be persuaded to end the system. And so, you know, making the enemy, I just don't think is the appropriate, you know, is the best course. You know, if I were trying the case, I wouldn't open on Zionists or the enemy to the jury. So I'm suggesting a reorientation of the framing and a focus on that framing and hitting it hard and hitting it home over and over again. That's not to say we shouldn't be pointing out the evils of settler colonialism, the evils of racism, and the evils of a political Zionist project. But Peter Beinart, you know, I told you this story. I brought a case on behalf of a young Jewish woman who was teaching at a Reformed temple in Westchester, who was fired because she wrote a blog post criticizing the May 2021 bombing of Gaza, and in the course of which she identified herself as an anti-Zionist in a congregation that is perhaps the foremost Reform congregation in the nation, and a big adherent to the Union of Reform Judaism's Zionist label. And the man who hired her read the blog post and initially supported her. He was the associate rabbi and the director of the school. And what he said, he brought up Peter Beinart. He said, have you read any Peter Beinart? You know, he calls himself a post-Zionist or a non-Zionist. Why don't you, what he was saying is, why don't you consider changing your label? Don't change your views, change your label. And so I called Peter Beinart. I said, what are you? Are you a post-Zionist? Are you a non-Zionist? He said, I really sort of define myself like a cultural Zionist, you know. But Peter Beinart is the guy who has broken through at the New York Times. He is now a contributing opinion writer who is criticizing Israel. The foremost critical New York Times opinion columnist criticizing Israel. He's not an enemy. I don't care if he calls himself a cultural Zionist or a non-Zionist or a post-Zionist, because to me, the battle is to dismantle the apartheid structure. And when we do that, we will be dismantling the settler colonial project as well. So that's my response to you, Mark.
Okay, so
What do you think?
let me respond quickly, and then I think we should give it over to the rest of the folks. Okay,
I'm with you.
all right. See, you got me started on Peter Beinart. This is not good because
No, you started. You started with Peter Beinart.
look, people are more. I mean, I would love to have a conversation with him, but he won't talk to me. Yeah, Tom Getman's been trying to get him to talk to me for a while. You could try that as well. I would love to debate him because people are very. He wrote a book, 13 years ago called "The Crisis of Zionism," which is pure liberal Zionism, and it comes back to the basic argument of liberal Zionists, which I think they haven't departed from, and I think which at bottom he's come a long. People are very excited about how he's come a long way, right? But fundamentally, he still wants to make it work. Fundamentally, he said this in The Crisis of Zionism. He said there's a good Israel and there's a bad Israel. In those days, the bad Israel was the quote occupation, and the good Israel was what could still happen within the original 1948 armistice lines, right? That's crap. We all know that it's crap now. That there is one single entity, and it's a single apartheid entity. There's no occupation. There's no green line. I didn't understand that. There's no green line. So I think he's still there because at bottom he's still, and he would hate this label, he's still a Jewish exceptionalist. Just like Christian Zionism is exceptionalist. It means that what we've got is so good that we have to make it work because it's so good and we're so good. Okay, I mean, you're getting back to sort of the burden that I carry from growing up as a traditional Jewish Zionist, which is very exceptionalist. We're terrific. And what we're doing is terrific. And it excuses us from crimes. But most of all, we have to make it work because we're terrific and it's a good thing. And there's a romance and a mystique and a mythology to that. So that's the enemy. I mean, it's not going to be ad hominem. Peter's not an enemy. Zionists, quote, and apologists for Israel are not the enemy. Zionism and the whole ideology and sensibility underneath that, and I understand that because I grew up with it, is the enemy. So there's no jury here. I reject your analogy because we're not trying to persuade anybody, okay? The South African government, the Pretoria government did not come down, and there's no judge either. It did not come down because they were persuaded. Those Afrikaners, most of them went to their graves believing that apartheid was a noble enterprise. De Klerk said that in the last interview of his life, okay? And by the way, I don't think Ben Gurion was a Zionist. Ben Gurion was a fanatical dictator who didn't have the interests of the Jewish people at heart at all. And he was willing to give up, read Suarez's book, Tom Suarez's book. I mean, the Zionists created all kinds of crimes. They sent people back to Germany. They rejected opportunities to send Jewish children to safety because they weren't being sent to Palestine. So I mean, that's the, when you get down to the core of it, that's what Zionism hath wrought, and that what it has wrought today. Apartheid is an epiphenomenon. It's just part of the problem. It's just part of what Israel has to try to do. It's like the Bantustans. All right, that was not the evil. That was an expression of the evil and the expression of the effort of the South African government to stay alive and to stay in power by, quote, reform. That's all you're going to get, ultimately, with what Peter Beinart is up to and with what Gershon Baskin is up to, about this guy Schwartz, who did this wonderful movie about Tantura. You should read his, in my last blog, I wrote about that. He wrote a wonderful movie. He made a wonderful movie about Tantura, and he exposed the atrocity and the crime of what the Haganah did in Tantura, okay? And at the end, he said, and so this is terrible, we have to fix this, it's horrible, we have to admit the crime, and we have to re-envision Zionism so that it can be something good and it can work. That's what he comes down to. So that's where they are.
Okay.
And I'll stop with that.
All right. So look, I just want to make one comment, and then I'm going to take some questions. You say there's no jury here, there's no judge here. I say to you, yes, there is. There's a jury. There was a jury in South Africa. It was the international community and how to mobilize them, how to persuade them. And there is one here too, because we all are involved in trying to find ways to persuade the entire international community, and especially the powerful forces that act against us in the West, that what's going on in Israel is wrong, and it needs to be changed, and it needs to be dismantled. So I just think we need to focus on our narrative framing and our themes with that in mind. Okay, here's one question for you.
One last word on that. One last word on that, Bob.
Go ahead. Yeah.
But it's not about persuasion. Okay, it's not about, we're getting in an argument with Zionists about whether Zionism is good or bad or can be reformed or not. It's a dead end, and we're wasting our time. It's not about persuasion. It's about action. What the international community has to do is not be involved in a dialogue with liberal Zionists. What the international community has to do is to make it impossible for Israel to govern, and to isolate Israel in the international community through economic means, through cultural means, economic boycott, cultural boycott, academic boycott, all of that. That's what will work. So, I mean,
well, look,
we've been talking about whether Zionism is good or bad or can be reformed or not. It is a dead end. Yes, we have to stay with international law. We have to say this is a crime, and so maybe you're right. Maybe if we stay with here I am arguing against myself again. Maybe if we just talk about apartheid, that's the way to get there. Anyway.
Okay, well, I think that's.
Let's hear what people have to say. Let's go to the jury, okay?
Right, but that's the nut of what I'm saying. You know, when you try a case to a jury, you're looking for action. The action is the verdict. But in order to get the verdict, you have to persuade them of your narrative frame. And that's the same thing we face here. All right, here's a question for you from David Mandel. If you say Zionism is the problem without defining it, you end up arguing about what it means instead of organizing to end apartheid and colonialism. Ericott is correct, but that doesn't contradict the strategic suggestions that Bob was talking about. What do you say to David?
I would say that we do need to acknowledge that Zionism is the problem. Because if you say that Israel is in violation of international law, or Israel is practicing apartheid, then the action can be to go back to Israel and say, stop doing that. Right? You have to give equal rights to Palestinians. you have to establish ultimately one democratic state where everybody has the same rights and you have a constitution. Okay? The thing is that in order for that to happen, David, the whole ideology that the state was founded on has to be completely dismantled. That's Zionism. You can't have one democratic state. You can't have democracy and Zionism side by side. They can't coexist. Zionism says the state has to be a Jewish state for the Jewish people. What we're seeing now in the present government is the inevitable development that had to happen. I say bring it on, because it's the true face of Israel and it's the true face of Zionism. So in a way, I mean, for South Africa, apartheid really was the ideology. Apartheid is not the ideology in Israel. You know, apartheid said, was the South African Zionism in a way. It said, God wants us to do this. God says that the races have to be separate because God gave us this land and the others have to be basically slaves or serve us. It's not their country. It's not their land, right? Zionism says that. You can't possibly move ahead and dismantle and get to something new without addressing that directly.
Well, the interesting thing about what you're saying is it's the mirror image of what I'm saying about the apartheid frame. And they both lead to dismantling.
Yeah, but
what I'm saying to you is that it's a much more effective appeal to the international audience to use the apartheid frame rather than the Zionist frame. But the objective is the same.
No, but Bob, it doesn't address the root cause. Apartheid is not a root cause. Apartheid does not say this has to be a land for the Jewish people and we have to have supremacy and a majority. It doesn't say that.
I know, but sometimes
Israel doesn't even say it's an apartheid state. It doesn't even acknowledge that.
But sometimes you don't have to get to the root cause. You can affect change.
All right,
you can affect change, the exact change that you want to get by the narrative frame of the root cause, by a more appealing narrative frame that gets to the same place and really incorporates some of the same.
Yeah, but when you say more appealing to who? All right, let's get to another question.
Okay. All right. This one is from Don Linda Wagner. Glad you made this distinction on apartheid and settler colonialism, which moves us to deal with the genocide dimension of Zionism. A difficult discussion, but necessary. This includes a critique of mainstream Herzlian Zionism and political Christian Zionism. Say more and let's find the link to Nora Ericott's piece. So let me just say there are other comments and questions about genocide, you know, like Jonathan Affleck, wouldn't genocide be an even better framing? Apartheid is only a secondary crime. The primary crime of Zionism is genocide. It is true that genocide and apartheid are both international crimes. I just think it's easier to make the apartheid case than the genocide case, only because genocide in many, many minds involves, you know, the wholesale destruction of the people, you know, the death and destruction of the people, and the oppression of the Palestinians is conducted slowly over time. We're in a rush. We'll dismantle 10 homes today, maybe another 10 tomorrow, next month. So it looks a little less like genocide. Mark, you want to comment on those questions?
Well, I'll tell you where I'm going as I'm listening. People are talking. The conversation is going where I think it needs to go, which is where you pointed it, Bob, which is, what do we do? What's the strategy? What does this tell us? Where does this lead us? And I'm asking myself, okay, so why am I all hung up on Zionism? Is it just because, is it personal? You know, is it just that I'm so horrified and ashamed of the Zionism that I grew up with and that was embedded inside me?
I have that feeling myself, by the way, so I understand exactly what you're saying.
Of course. And I think, you know, Don Wagner and maybe many other Christians have the same feelings about that, because, you know, what you grew up with, which was the Christian Zionism, or the more conservative kind, which is even in some ways more despicable and dangerous. But, you know, okay, so, you know, when I finally got to the West Bank and met the Palestinians in 2006, I encountered the wall. You know, the wall had already gone up in many places. And, you know, I talk about this and I write about this, and it's kind of, you know, literary and poetic and dramatic, but I felt like I understood and I recognized what that wall was. That was a wall that had been erected inside my heart and that I had to overcome. It was that destructive personally. And that's connected, you know, that's connected to the whole interpenetrated complex of religion and Zionism that I grew up with. That leads me back to religion, and it leads me back to, if we want to talk about strategy, it leads me back to the churches, okay? In 1982, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches had its conference. They have one every, I don't know, I think every 7 years. The last one was in Leipzig, Germany, in 2015. They had every 7 years. 1982, they had it in Ottawa, Canada, and 8 Black pastors turned up and refused to sit at the communion table. They had some sort of table Eucharist with the others in this conference, because they said, we can't do this at home. Our church is officially and almost doctrinally segregated. Black and white do not sit at the Lord's table together. And to its credit, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, now the World Community of Reformed Churches, said, we are now in status confessionis. Nothing moves in our communion until we've taken on this fundamental threat to our faith, which is that all humanity is equal. We don't differentiate between people on the basis of race or anything else. Okay, and they did the Protestant equivalent of excommunicating the offending churches, mostly English-speaking churches in South Africa, but Black churches were involved in it as well. Basically suspending them and saying, you're not part of our community. We've kicked you out until you fix this. And eventually it spread ecumenically. All the churches of the world came out and declared apartheid a heresy. And I submit to you that this was an important nail in the coffin of apartheid. Not long after that, when the churches came out and said no more, both the Thatcher and the Reagan governments finally gave in and joined the sanctions, despite their Cold War mentality about what that meant. And it led to the cascading, you know, unraveling of apartheid. The churches play a big role here. Theology and ideology plays a big role here. And Zionism is very, very much a part of that conversation right now. And the churches are far ahead of anything that's happening politically, even in terms of BDS, in terms of coming out strongly against Israel and what it's doing. So, I just want to throw that in.
No, I think it's a really important point. And if I could excommunicate the enormous numbers of the Jewish clergy who know what's going on in Israel, have known it since they were first there, because most rabbis go to Israel, they take congregants and so forth. For their failure to speak out, I would, but it is part of the nature of clergy to not speak out for fear of alienating their congregations, splitting their congregations, and that's a very, very significant problem. It was a problem in South Africa. It was a problem in Germany, in Nazi Germany. Brian Brown's book, Israeli, South African apartheid, Israeli apartheid, points out the collaboration of the churches in South Africa with the government and the very close relationship they had until, as you point out, there was a shift. So I agree with you.
Here's a better analogy. Here's a better analogy. You're bringing up clergy, the civil rights movement. Okay, that was grassroots. And I see that Don has made another comment, or maybe it was Linda, that it's about the grassroots. I know it travels from the grassroots up. So I remember this was way back, 2006, 2007. I was at a Seville conference in Birmingham, Alabama, and we were all giving talks, and I was sitting with a Methodist, a white Methodist pastor, a minister at lunch at the church, and I said, why is it that we can't get rabbis and preachers and pastors for that matter to speak out against what's happening with Israel and speak out for the Palestinians? He said, no, it's just like it was here. In the beginning, if you got up and talked about integration at your pulpit, if you survived the night, you were out on the next bus the next morning, you were gone. He said, but slowly, a few people started to take a stand, they started to speak up, people started marching with them, and eventually it overtook and it became a mass movement. That's what you're going to see here. Now, it's being very, very, very slow. There are all kinds of good reasons for that. But I think the clergy and the theology students in the seminaries, okay, the way to reach them is in some ways through their Bibles. They believe, because when they read their Bibles, that what is happening is the will of God. They read Genesis, right? Blacks as well are raised in an Exodus theology, but as soon as they hit the ground in Palestine and they see it's upside down, and the Israelites, are not who were liberated from slavery, are not the Jews, it's the Palestinians, and Pharaoh, is the prime minister of Israel. So that's why the Bible is important here, because there is a grassroots movement happening now in the churches. And eventually, again, I think in terms of strategy, when we have a phalanx of religious leaders, it can be Christians and Jews, but if the Jews won't come along, it can just be Christians descending on Capitol Hill and saying, we don't like your policy. And if other geopolitical things line up, because it's not only going to be a matter of that, there could be a change in US policy. And if anything's going to bring Israel down and give the Israelis, I include the Jews with that, an opportunity for a better life, that's what it's going to be.
Yeah, I want to just give you a little, just to respond a little bit to that. I came late to this enterprise. I didn't speak out outside the tribe until 2014, when Operation Protective Edge pushed me over the edge. Mm-hmm. And then I joined JVP, and the first real thing I did was go as part of their national delegation to the United Church of Christ General Synod in 2015, where they entertained a BDS resolution, passed it for the first time. And I thought, wow, that's fabulous. It only took 3.5 years for the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement to depose President Johnson. You know, and we're going to have, you know, we're going to have great success. Last year, the UCC, by the way, in 2015, they rejected the apartheid resolution. Last year, they passed a resolution condemning apartheid and called it a sin.
Mhm.
So I think that the apartheid framing can be used effectively in the churches as well. And then I want to pick up on one thing you said earlier, which I thought was really, really interesting, and that is you sort of asked yourself, well, you know, why am I wedded to the Zionist framing? And one of the things that we've learned in studying advocacy, both in the trial bar and elsewhere, is that we all have these deeply implanted narrative frames, especially when we work at something. We see it, we keep seeing it in a way. It's really difficult to change a narrative frame once it's imposed. So I consider myself sort of lucky that I've only been at this game for 8 years. And I think I'm less wedded. I'm an anti-Zionist, but I'm less wedded to that frame because it hasn't just been a critical part of my advocacy here. But these are things that trial lawyers study and talk about all the time, and it's the reason that who goes first in addressing the jury has an enormous tactical advantage, by the way.
Bob, I see that people are raising their hands, and we want to honor that and give people a chance to weigh in.
The problem that I have is that I only have a screen because I have to look at, hold on a minute, let me.
I see David Mandel, I see Don and Linda Wagner Khatib. Those are the only hands I see up, but I also was looking.
Okay. All right. Let's start. I saw. Well, hold on a minute because I just want to make sure that I have. Okay. All right. David Mandel, unmute yourself.
Okay, I did. Thanks. Hi, Bob. And hi, Mark. We met once a long time ago, Mark. I don't know you as well as I know Bob, but I wasn't sure whether I'd be able to speak, so I just wrote a long thing in the chat, which I would, with all, encourage people to read because it really spells out what I think about this whole debate. But in addition to that, I would ask people to just do a quick thought exercise, a little counterintuitive. What if Palestine had been a land without a people? What if it had been really empty? It wasn't, of course, and that's one of the main roots of the problem. But then would Zionism would have been like a quaint attempt at recreating Jewish nationhood in a place where Jews had roots. I still think I would have been against it because I prefer more class and anti-imperialist based solutions to oppression. But Zionism arose initially as a one answer that was supported by a pretty small minority of the Jewish people in Europe to intense oppression of Jews in Europe. But had Palestine really been an empty land, we wouldn't be having this debate today about how horrible Zionism is, because they would have created a Jewish state and some Jews would have gone there and done their thing. Now, the reason I say that is because I think the anti-Zionist argument has become so entwined with the argument about what Israel has actually done, what the Zionist movement actually did, which was to confront and exclude and expel most of the Palestinians who did live there. It wasn't an empty land. But my point is that the problem, that I still agree with Bob here, that the problem is not Zionism as a nationalist phenomenon per se, like a lot of other national movements that sought to create and ended up creating a lot of ethnic states in Europe, which were themselves became very problematic because they didn't have pure geographical regions in which to do their own thing either. So the Zionism really wasn't an exception to that problem, but another example of it. So, this is, I don't want to restate everything that I wrote in the chat, that long chat a few minutes ago. I would ask people to read it if you can, save the chat and maybe look at it afterwards if it's too long. But I think essentially I'm agreeing with Bob here that to Zionism has so many, we often rant and rave against Zionism, and I'm against it for its own objective reasons, but without defining it, without appreciating that so many people have very different definitions of it, and that it hasn't really existed as an independent movement with goals since 1948, when its main goal was accomplished, and it's become just a support center for all the awful things that the state of Israel has been doing.
Okay.
And I'd rather
Mark,
concentrate on those things and not get bogged down with arguments about what Zionism is, which so often is not defined by people who use it one way or another.
Mark,
Thanks.
you want to comment?
My main comment is I forgot that I didn't see Holly's hand for some reason. So
Well, we're going to get to Holly. We're going to Don, and then we're going to do Holly. Do you want to comment on?
My only comment in response to David, thank you, David, is that and Bob, you made this point too. Zionism is taken many forms. Beinert's talking about herself, as you said, as a cultural Zionist. Zionism is Zionism in whatever the forms it takes, and I think liberal Zionism in its many forms, or apologetic Zionism in its many forms, is even more dangerous than the more conservative, radical kind. That's all. But let's go on.
Don and Linda, do you want to unmute, please?
Yes. Hi. Thanks for a great discussion. And Mark, you've helped me a lot on moving to the place where I think the narrative focus and the critique is settler colonialism. Through that lens, you get at Zionism, you get at apartheid, and you deal with genocide. And Bob, for going to the international community, I think it's got to be a ground up mobilization to get there. Because what if the U.S., and I think the U.S. and Israel could undermine the International Criminal Court, then where do we go? I think the focus has to be bottom-up mobilization through the churches. And again, through the settler colonial analysis, we also get at Christian Zionism, both the mainline liberal and the right-wing fundamentalist. As Mitri Raheb said, we Palestinians are occupied by Israel and by the Bible. Settler colonial analysis is the best way to get at all of this. So I'd like to get Mark's response and thanks for a great conversation.
And gee, Don, I thought that question was going to be directed at me, but go ahead, Mark.
I agree with Don. I think I'd like to hear from Holly. She's had her hand up for a long time.
Well, before we get to Holly, we're going to get to you next. I just want to say to Don that I agree that the mobilization needs to be from the ground up. And if settler colonialism is a frame that works with the 50 million American Christian Zionists, I'm all for it. I just have my doubts.
It doesn't work yet. It's up to us.
Okay, amen. Holly, unmute, please.
Yes, I did. Thank you very much. I'm with the Interfaith Council for Peace in the Middle East in Northeast Ohio. And Mark, I know you've been involved with some lectures in the Ohio area. Some of our members happen to be children. Well, they were children in the Nakba. So they are in their 80s now, and I am embedded with a lot of their culture and their experiences. Of course, we have Jewish people in our group also. This discussion is a little I don't know how to say it well, but we're talking about apartheid, we're talking about colonialism. It's kind of academic in some ways, and it's important. But it is different than if I had heard Palestinian people here, you know, because it's more real. We know that people in the United States citizens are in Israeli jails as we talk, and they can't get out. And they don't even have a charge against them. And our politicians, I'm so glad that I think, Bob, you brought it up. Our politicians are powerless. We have people from Israel coming and talking to our Congress. And we can't even get an American out of their jail. Children are being snatched from their homes in the middle of the night. These are things that bother me, you know, and whether you call it apartheid or colonialism or occupation. I mean, here you are, 55 years old, trying to cross to go to the hospital, and you have these kids that grew up in Chicago or New York with machine guns on them, waiting, you know, well, you can't go today to the hospital. So these things are just like, I want to make it real. And that's what I think that will shake up these politicians a little more, because I don't think they see it. They go on junkets to Israel, not behind the wall. They don't see Palestinians, and they don't see the jails. And I don't know how to do that. What, cut off the purse strings of the wealthy? Cut off AIPAC? I mean, that's what it gets down to, right? Religion is there, but religion's behind it all. I mean, they're in bed with each other. Forget this business about separation of church and state. It's scary. It's scary. And so I look to people that are thinking about this all the time, and that's why I joined this this Zoom, because it infuriates me. And I know that it infuriates you too. It's just that I'm being, you know, a little more blunt about things.
Well, you
Anyway.
have a right to vent. And I agree with you about the importance of getting Palestinians and Palestinian Americans into speaking roles, especially in the mainstream media, a role to which has really been denied them for decades and decades and decades. And it's a really, really important problem. But I do think that in the last 2 years, along with the exposure of the apartheid frame, there's progress, is slow beginning progress is being made. The New York Times has a Palestinian journalist reporting from Palestine who's fabulous, and her stories are, you know, that this is something new. And Foreign Affairs just had an article advocating for a one-state solution, and one of the authors was a Palestinian. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. Mark, you want to comment?
Well, I'm going to add my voice to those who are clapping and saying bravo to Holly.
Yes.
My wife is representing adding to that as well. And Holly, I don't remember you from Ohio, but I'm sure we've met. It is happening. You know, the one-state solution is now on the table. Apartheid, to get back to you, whether Israel is apartheid or not, is being debated in the halls of Congress every once in a while if somebody mentions the word. So it's useful in that way. It's all important. It's important to talk about Zionism, especially with the churches and the synagogues. It's important to talk about apartheid if that causes controversy and gets people talking. Betty McCollum is active and is throwing bills into, has a bill about children. 18 Democrats refused to sign the latest pro forma congratulations from the United States officially from Congress for the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the State of Israel, because it didn't mention the two-state solution. Crazy down the rabbit hole logic, but okay. It means that they are thinking about it and there are debates going on. We can't quit. We have to do it all. We have to bring BDS to our communities, to our churches, maybe someday to our synagogues. We have to keep visiting and bringing people over there as much as possible. There's no substitute for that. There are some bishops in some countries who are saying to their folks, to their clergy, if you take a trip to Israel, you've got to work with Palestinian tour guides. You can't do the usual Dead Stones trip. All of those things are important, and it's happening. And the arc of history, is moving.
Okay, so Ben Ashmore has a question. When considering the broader religious themes vis-a-vis apartheid and contrasting South Africa with Israel-Palestine, what impact do you think is played by the large swaths of Christianity, especially those leaning evangelical, that believe a predicate to the second coming is the resurgence of the Jewish state? E.g., example, the rebuilding of the temple, and thus these broader groups and theistic canons cannot at the same time condemn Israel and its actions concerning Palestine without seeing that as an action against the promised second coming of which the New Testament speaks. Mark?
What do I think of that? And there are folks even more qualified than I to comment on that. Don wrote the book on it. Well, it's not biblical. In theological Christian terms, it's heretical. And there are churches that are coming out and actually saying that. The church of, one of the churches in Scandinavia, Sweden and Norway, came out, and their bishops came out and said, we don't buy it. And it's happening here in some tall steeple, major Protestant denominations as well. So now, those folks, for the most part, you can't talk to them, although you can't generalize about evangelicals. Many evangelicals are more open to understanding what's happening in Palestine than many mainline Protestants in the United States. You can't talk to them because they don't care about the Jewish people. They don't love the Jewish people as they profess to. They're involved in a self-centered ideology which has nothing to do with human rights, or for that matter, about Jesus or the Bible. So it's just wrong, and it's there are a lot of them, but there are more of us, and those folks will, as Jesus would say, will have always been with us, and they will continue to be with us. What we have to think about is what kind of power they exert on Capitol Hill. And that's part of the bigger problem that we're having in this country right now. Those folks are involved and are allied with the most reactionary, dangerous elements in politics that you can have. There was recently, and I can send you information about it if you didn't read the Palestine Portal report on it. There was recently a conference organized by Palestinians and the Presbyterian Church USA and the Coalition of Protestant Reformed Churches in South America, in Chile, about Christian Zionism. It was an amazing conference. And the thrust of it was that when we talk about Christian Zionism as a theological concept, what we're talking about is gender inequality, colonialism, the rape of the earth, and the impoverishment of the poor. and those are absolutely part of the bigger picture. And so that's how we need to think about Christian Zionism. It's not about Jesus coming back to Jerusalem. It's about continuing in the neoliberal program that's bringing humanity and the entire earth to the brink of destruction. That's how we need to think about Christian Zionism in that larger context. It's just one expression.
Okay. All right. So as Odile pointed out, Lillian Rosengarten, my friend, you have the floor. And then Odile, we'll get to you as well.
Hello. I'm very glad to see you, Mark. I want a very simple question. I'm a refugee from Nazi Germany. And I want to know, I'm a strong anti-Zionist. What do we do with Zionism if we focus on apartheid? What are we going to do with Zionism? It can't stay. It's deadly. So that's my question.
Okay, well, my answer would be, I guess, a quick answer would be that if we ever succeed in dismantling the apartheid structure of Israel-Palestine, we will succeed in eliminating many of the bad effects of Zionism.
But
not completely eliminating it necessarily, but it would. I think it would be a big step in the right direction. Mark? Oh yeah, you want to?
Just want to say one thing. It's because of Zionism that we have apartheid, and I'm just going to the apartheid is not dealing with the issue, in my opinion, and it upsets me to hear it. I wonder now what Mark is going to say about it.
Okay, Mark, go ahead.
That's been my argument, Lillian. I think that it opens the way to apologetics and to reform. Ultimately, it does get people's attention. I agree with you about that, Bob. It does get people's attention, and it's been very useful. And I'm not saying to throw it out, but I'm saying that we have to be cautious about that. If we stop there, then we're only dealing with an epiphenomenon. It can be massaged. Israel can say, okay, we're not going to do apartheid anymore. They can do this, that, and the other thing. It'll keep people happy, but we're not dismantling the fundamentals of the project, and it will go on, and it can't be reformed.
You see, that's actually the mirror. That's a mirror by argument, because I think the same thing can be said in the opposite direction. I am not in favor of stopping all discussion about the evils of Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
I am in favor of focusing much more of our attention and advocacy on the apartheid frame, as I think that will lead more quickly to the elimination of many of the evils that we see in Israel-Palestine. And that's to me, that's the most important thing. We can debate academically about Zionism and racism and settler colonialism. But what I want to accomplish is the fastest and most complete elimination of the oppression of the Palestinians. And to me, the apartheid framing is critical to that effort, to our advocacy in that direction. We all want the same things. We want action, but we need to persuade, and we need to implant what I think is a much more powerful narrative framing. That's all I'm suggesting. Odile, the floor is yours. Would you unmute?
Hello, yes. I was part in Berkeley of the anti-apartheid movement, and we divested. But then there was a terrific poverty that continued its racist policy in South Africa. So it's a complicated question, But I think being anti-apartheid has been accepted, and it would be strategically a good idea to restart a movement that way. But it's not enough, as you said, and we need to go deeper than that to, you know, to kind of change those colonial practices that have been implemented all over the world. And so, yeah, I think strategically is a good point to restart with an anti-apartheid movement because it's well known and we can move forward into the street that way. And we have to be specific on what our demands are going to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's getting near our stopping time at 1:30. Mark, if you have any 2 minutes closing remarks, go ahead. How about it? But, no, okay. So look, I want to thank everybody. I think this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you all sticking with us and your questions and comments. And I hope you'll first of all give Mark a hand for coming and joining us, and that you will join us on future webinars.
Yeah, Bob, don't hang